causal categories on the world. It is by seeing the world in a certain way, let's say a scientific way, that we see things in terms of cause and effect relations. But when we examine ourselves and examine our consciousness, that's not the way we see ourselves. He doesn't deny the scientific view of the mind. One can examine, as many philosophers and psychologists are now examining, the neurology of the mind and the psychology in such a way that one does talk about causal ideas of all sorts. Nevertheless, one has to separate here, as Kierkegaard did, between the objective scientific view and the phenomenological first-person action-oriented view. And what Sartre is doing is insisting that for the purposes of his phenomenology, what we always adopt is this first-person action-oriented view of ourselves. And from that point of view, consciousness is nothingness, at least now in two senses. First, it is not a possible object of consciousness. It is not a thing. And second, that consciousness is not caused. And of course, from there, it's a short step to saying, if consciousness is not caused, it is free. The word Sartre often uses here, and again, it's prone to misunderstanding, is the word spontaneity. Now, some philosophers have interpreted spontaneity as a kind of indeterminism, and they've appealed, for example, the free will question to current science and pointed out that in quantum theory, causal relationships break down and whether something happens is purely a matter of chance. But of course, this isn't going to work if we're talking about freedom, because if in fact I acted simply by chance, we would certainly not talk about my actions being free. We want to talk about my actions being chosen, and that's the very opposite of being undetermined. Talking about spontaneity, on the other hand, allows him to carve out a kind of middle range between determinism and indeterminism, and talk about agency on the one hand, but nevertheless emphasize the thesis that he's already made in his essay on the emotions, that much of what we do is pre-reflective. That is, it's not conscious in the full-blown sense. It's not articulate. It's not the subject of thought. It is not the subject of the kind of reflection in which we name what we're feeling or name what we are doing. We just do it. Spontaneity is the freedom of consciousness, which is to say that to understand consciousness is to understand from the outset that consciousness acts, and it acts in such a way that it acts without any prior causality. What Sartre will also have to say, if he's to hold this thesis, is that all the questions that psychologists have traditionally asked about motivation and the like have to somehow be absorbed, if not on the causal side of consciousness, then on the object side of consciousness. And in fact, that's just what Sartre does. That many of the questions about motivation and emotion that are usually attributed to a causal account of consciousness and action, what Sartre will say is that motivation and emotion, in fact, now lie on the object side of emotion, and they are considerations in terms of which we make the choices that we do. I might add that by the time he writes Being and Nothingness, 5 years after his essay on the emotions, one of the things that he has given up is the rather oversimplified thesis that emotions are always a mode of escape behavior. That might work still for some kinds of emotions. I think the fox example with the grapes would be a good instance of that. There are times when we have emotions and it's pretty clear that the purpose is to save us from some kind of embarrassment or humiliation, even in our own minds. But Sartre, by the time he writes Being and Nothingness, is also aware that emotions have many different purposes and many different ends. And among other things, he is by now, having been through the war, or a good chunk of it, is well aware of the heroic function of emotions too. So what he wants to say is here that emotions are not to be construed as causes of behavior, in that he holds with his old view, but rather emotions are to be construed as spontaneous outpourings of consciousness in which one takes the world in a certain way. So we're not talking about emotions in consciousness, just as in the early essay we didn't talk in Jamesian terms about emotions as sensations, but rather we're talking about emotions as ways of structuring consciousness, but now as one way among many of structuring consciousness. But the idea that consciousness is nothingness has a further meaning, and one that really makes Sartre's thesis about freedom all the more plausible. One of the most remarkable things about consciousness is the fact that it has the power of negation. To put it very simply, consciousness spontaneously says no. But this isn't just a matter of denial. That would be certainly pathological. It's rather a more pervasive feature of consciousness which Sartre feels is absolutely essential to understand the nature of consciousness itself, as well as the nature of the freedom he wants to celebrate. In a way, you might say it's prefigured in Husserl. Husserl gives an example of perception and points out to us that when we look at something, say that coffee cup, in one sense what I see immediately is the coffee cup from a certain perspective. But at the same time, what I see is a coffee cup, which means, among other things, it has a backside which I don't see. It has an underneath which I don't see. It has weight, which I am not now feeling. It has a texture. And one can imagine if I were to reach for the coffee cup and discover any of these things not being so, I would be shocked and surprised. There's a sense then in which what I see is not just what I see, but it has to do with a host of expectations which are built into the perception itself. So there's a sense in which what I see is always more than what I see. What I see is already defined by expectations of all sorts, including those built into the perception itself, but also more generally having to do with my values and expectations. For instance, I gave the example earlier of a mountain, which might present itself as an obstacle to one people, as protection for another, as an aesthetic object for still another, as a point of recreation, perhaps for still another. Well, in the same sense, when we see, we are never simply passive receivers. I gave the flashlight example a minute ago, but let me correct that one more way. It's not just that there is no flashlight, but one can't look at the beam as itself simply picking up the reflections that the objects give off. To the contrary, the beam itself is dynamically active, and it structures the way we see things. So, to talk about negation here is to talk in a very powerful way about consciousness as an activity which is not simply a matter of receiving, as many of the early empiricists suggested, but rather it's a matter of shaping, as the early essay on emotions made quite clear. Now this has a number of different manifestations for Sartre. For one thing, any situation in which we find ourselves, we can say, I refuse to accept this. In fact, that's very reflective of what I just said. But we have at least one clear set of instances which permeate our lives, in which the power of negation is evident right at the basis of consciousness, even in its most primitive forms. And that's the notion of desire. Because when you think, what is a desire actually? It's not just seeing the world, but it's seeing the world in terms of something you want. If you look at that delicious piece of chocolate cake, it is not just a factual perception, it's not just the recognition, aha, there's a chocolate cake, but rather it's looking with desire. It's looking with already the expectation or the hope that one will quite literally internalize that piece of chocolate cake as soon as possible. We see things in terms of what we can do with them. We see things in terms of how they fit into our plans. One might look, for example, at a notice from the IRS as an opportunity to express oneself, to explain oneself, or I think more realistically for most of us, one might spy the same invitation with a kind of horror as something that is going to interfere with our lives. There is nothing in the fact of the matter that dictates this, but how we perceive it and the expectations. This is all what Sartre builds into this notion of negation. There's a sense in which our perceptions are always filled with negation in another sense as well. Take, for instance, I walk into a bar, and I'm supposed to meet my friend Peter. But I walk into the bar, and I look around, and what I see, quite simply, is that Peter's not there. Now, one can construe this in terms that many philosophers would find plausible, along the lines of what I see is, and now we make a list of all the people in the bar, and all the furniture in the bar, and all the bottles in the bar, and the glasses in the bar, and perhaps the architecture of the bar. And one examines that list and notices that on it, Peter isn't there. Well,